Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's ESRF ILL colloquium, which we are broadcasting via Zoom, and which will be posted on YouTube after when it will be finished. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is Anne-Marie Lagrange, who is a distinguished expert on exoplanets. Anne-Marie Lagrange studied at École Polytechnique in Palaiseau near Paris, and she received a PhD at the Institut d'Astrophysique de Paris in 89. And from 89 to 90, she did a postdoc at ESO in Garching in Germany. And in 90, she was hired as a senior scientist at the Laboratoire d'Astrophysique de Grenoble, where she has worked since. In 2000, she was promoted research director at CNRS. And from 2004 to 2006, she has served as deputy director of Institut National des Sciences de l'Univers, which is the branch of CNRS in charge of astronomy and astrophysics. And Anne-Marie Lagrange has received a number of very distinguished awards. In fact, quite early in her career, for example, in '94, she received the CNRS Bronze Medal, and then a number of very prestigious awards, like in 2012, Prix Irène Joliot-Curie, and 2017, Prix Jean Ricard of the French Physics Society. And in 2013, she was elected as a member of the French Academy of Sciences. Before we start the colloquium, I will give you a few information on how we proceed for the discussion, since this is via Zoom. There is a question and answer box, which you are invited to use to drop your questions. Don't wait until the end of the presentation to write in your questions, because you can view them and then upvote questions you consider most important, most relevant to you, so that in the end, we have a view of which questions should be considered priority for the discussion. And essentially, that's it with the technical points. And therefore, I'm glad to give the mic to Anne-Marie Lagrange. Anne-Marie, please, we're looking forward to listen to your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to talk about exoplanet. I'm very happy to do that. As you know, the possible existence of planets outside the solar system, what we call exoplanets, has been raised for many centuries, but the question remained as a rather philosophical question, because we lacked of instruments to see whether such world existed or not. And so it was until just until a little bit more than 2 decades ago that we could observe the exoplanets. And now this part of astronomy has become a major field of astronomy, and it has also many connections with other fields, such as biology, for instance, if we want to understand if life can exist somewhere else. It has also, of course, a lot of bridges with physics and chemistry, but these are more natural bridges. So for us, the main question that we have concerning extrasolar planetary system is how frequent are they? Until 2 decades ago, we really didn't know how frequent they were. And actually we thought that maybe they were not that frequent. how they, what they look like. Are there, have they the same architecture as the solar system that you see here, with the sun, the internal planet, telluric planet, Mercury, Venus,
Sorry
Earth.
to interrupt, Anne-Marie, we don't see your slide yet.
Pardon me?
We don't see your slide yet.
Oh, you should.
No, the sharing has not started yet.
Ah, so I have to go out and share again. Okay. Is this okay?
That's perfect now. Thank you.
So now you can see the solar system with the sun, the internal planet, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, which are terrestrial planets, and the giant planets here, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. To give you an idea, an order of scale, the Earth is at 150 million kilometers from the sun. This is what we call an astronomical unit, which is our unit, our basic unit for us. Jupiter is located at 5 astronomical units, and its weight, it is 300 times as heavy as the Earth. So we want to know if the solar system is unique or not, or if the planets in other systems are distributed in another way. We want to know the physical properties of extrasolar planets in terms of interiors and in terms of atmosphere. We want to understand how they form, and we want to see if we could find signatures of life in the future. Of course, we know that the sun is only one star among hundreds of thousands in the galaxy, and there are thousands of millions of galaxies, billion of galaxies in the universe. So we can anticipate that many other extrasolar planet system exists. As I said, one of the major questions that we ask as astrophysicists is how planetary systems form. And the question is not new. And of course, since for many years, it has remained as how did the solar system form, but it is really something very important for us because it is at the basis of the theories that we use. The first real theories of formation of the solar system were done mainly in the 18th century. And we have, I like to quote Buffon because it's something very interesting. This guy was an expert in many fields, as many of the scientists in the 18th century. And he proposed that the planets in the solar system were formed from the collision of comets on the sun, which took away from material from the sun that then condensated to form the planets. And this was wrong, but he was the first to propose an age of the Earth which was old. He proposed 10 million years, which is of course not enough, we know that now, but it was something very revolutionary at this epoch. The first theories that Laplace proposed a theory of the primordial nebulae, and this theory has been the basis of the modern theory of formation of the solar system. Laplace understood that the solar system was born in clouds of gas and dust, and we will see that in a few moments. Of course, since Laplace, there have been many changes, and the solar system has been investigated by many ways, and in particular thanks to the exploration of the solar system. And we know a lot about planets, but also comets, asteroids, which are very important, and dust, which are very important objects for us. And now we know that the solar system and probably extrasolar planets also originate from condensates that are produced within molecular clouds. These molecular clouds are clouds of gas and dust. Of course, the gas is mainly hydrogen, and the grains are very small. It's 0.1 micron inside, and from this you have to build the sun and the planets. So you have to win 30 orders of magnitude in size and in weight for this material. In these clouds, you have condensates of gas and dust, which that you see here. Here, the size is about 1,000 astronomical units, or at least a few hundred astronomical units. And within these blobs, the material will accrete towards the center, will collapse and accrete towards the center of the cloud to produce the star. At the same time, because of the rotation, it will settle, the dust and the gas will settle down in a disk that will be the place where the planets and where the planets will form. Into a little bit more details, the main steps, as we understand now, of the formation of solar system planets are the following. We have first small grains in the interstellar medium, about 0.1 micron, which grow up when the dust settles into the disk to sizes of micron, and then to sizes of pebble, that is a centimeter size. And we know that we have to go through a step that is called the planetesimal step, which is a step where we have bodies that are in the 100 or 1 kilometer in size. And these are really the bricks of the formation of the planets. Close to the sun, these planetesimals will eventually aggregate to form moons, and then to form the Earth, or Earth-like planet, the terrestrial planet. Further away from the star, beyond what we call the snow line, which is the line where where water is icy, we will form like that cores of giant planets, which are in size 1,000 kilometers or several thousand kilometers, and these cores of giant planets will accrete the gas to form the giant planets. And we know from different arguments that this should come very fast, because most of the gas in the disk disappear in, let's say, less than a few million years. So giant planets must be formed very early in the life of the solar system. Actually, the main difficulty that is existing now concerning this different step is the step between the pebbles and the planetesimals. It was thought before that because there have been measurements in laboratory, because to see what you obtain when you have big stones that collide. The question is whether they will stick or whether they will split up and they will break down. And in fact, we have this problem of what we call the barrier of the 1 meter. It seems that we have some difficulties here to grow, let's say, linearly from the pebble size to the planetesimals, and this is something that is at the heart of the current research now, this peculiar step. As I said, until now we had only the example of the solar system, and during a long time, people have tried to search for planets that are like the solar system planets. And this is why maybe the first exoplanets were found so late. I will go back to that later. As I will show you also, seeing a planet, astronomy is a science of observation. Usually we observe something new and we try to understand what it is. Here we were looking for something that we thought we exist, but it was actually realized very early that seeing a planet would be something very difficult to achieve. So people have tried quite early, a few dozen years ago, to find planets with indirect ways, in the sense that people were not looking for the photons of the planets themselves, but on effects that they produce on the star as they are orbiting the stars. And in fact, it exploits the Kepler laws, which tell you that as in a two-body system, the two bodies orbit around the center of mass of the two bodies. And this is what we have here. We have a star that evolves around the center of gravity of the star and the planet evolves at a larger distance. And the period of evolution of the star and the planet is the same one. So the most natural way we can think of detecting a planet in the plane of the sky is to look at this wobble of the star in the sky. Yet the wobble is very small, and if you take, for instance, the sun and the solar system at 10 parsecs, which is really in the neighborhood of the sun, the wobble is only 2 mass over 12 years, the period of rotation of Jupiter. This is the wobble that Jupiter induces on the sun. And for the Earth, it's 2 microarcseconds. So it's very, very tiny. And so far, there's not been any real discovery of a planet with this method. But the Gaia satellite, which was launched in 213 by ESA, is now looking at many, at thousands and billions of stars, I should say. And in a few years from now, we will have probably 20 or at least 10,000 new planets discovered by this method, thanks to Gaia. Okay. Another method, which is also indirect, is to look at the variable of as the variation of the radial velocity of the star as the planet orbits around it. This is what we call the radial velocity method. Again, if there is a single planet on a circular orbit, you will have the velocity, the radial velocity will produce of the star will follow a sine law, and the amplitude depends on the mass of the planet and the distance to the star, and the period depends on the distance of the planet to the star. Again, we are dealing with small numbers. Jupiter induces a 13 meters per second variation of radial velocity over 12 years, and Earth 8 centimeters per second over 1 year. So it's really very small. Yet, this was with this method that the first exoplanet around a solar type star was discovered. It was discovered by Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz in 1995 at Observatoire de Haute-Provence in France. And it was, and you have this signal that was the discovery signal of a body that was orbiting around the star 51 Pegase, with a period of 4 days. And the mass of the planet that was deduced was half the mass of Jupiter. And this was really the beginning of extrasolar planet searches. because before, in fact, people had already tried to look at such planets with this method. It's about 10 years, but they were looking for planets similar to Jupiter. So they were looking for planets that were orbiting with periods of 12 years, which is huge, and it's really difficult to do these observations. Here, Michel and Didier found a planet that was actually not expected at all, turning around the star 100 times closer to the stars and Jupiter from the sun. And by the way, this is the result of the discoveries that led Michel and Didier to get the Nobel Prize last year. Since this early discovery in '95, the instruments have improved a lot. And you see here that with Elodie, which was the instrument that was used back in '95, the error bars associated to each measurement, each velocity measurement of the star was quite big. It was a little bit more than 10 meters per second. And since that time, new instruments have been built, in particular the instrument ARPS at in Chile at ESO, and this instrument gives a precision about 100 meters per second and 1 meter per second, sorry. And so this has allowed to detect planets which are much smaller than 51 Peg B. 51 Peg B was half the mass of Jupiter, and this one here around Proxima Centauri is 1.3 Earth masses. So we have a gain of about a factor 100 with this, thanks to the improvement of the instrumentation. There is a difference. 51 Peg is a solar type star, while Proxima Centauri, which is our closest neighbor, is a red dwarf, what we call a red dwarf. So it is a star that is much lighter than the sun. It's a fraction of mass of the sun, 0.3 solar mass. And it makes things very different because as the central mass is smaller, you can detect with the same precision, you can detect smaller planets. Also, the distance of the planet, 0.05 astronomical unit for a red dwarf star, makes that the planet is orbiting within the habitable zone of the star, of the system. The habitable zone is defined as very crude, roughly, as the zone where the water will be found liquid. And we think that liquid water is a necessary condition for life to emerge. So this is why we call that habitable zone. In the case of solar system, of the sun or sun-like stars, the habitable zone is much further away. This detection of Proxima Centauri has given a lot of hopes and dreams and a lot of illustration that are sometimes very interesting, but can be misleading for people who just read the press, because you see images of the planet that are completely very well, that are very optimistic, let's say. I would just, and so this, my only note is that in fact, what we have detected is that it's not images of the planet, it's the indirect signature of a planet. And in fact, this was a result that was presented 4 years ago. And now using a new instrument at the Very Large Telescope now, which is called Espresso, and which was built again by the Swiss team, they could get the same curve, velocity curve for Proxima Centauri, and you see with a much improved error bars. And this allows to be much more confident in the detection of the signal. as you see here, and maybe also to detect another planet, which would be a fraction of Earth's mass with a period of 5 days. But this is still to be confirmed, as we say, because there is still a lot of, the noise is quite high. But this is to show you how the instruments have progressed through the years. In 20 years, they have made amazing, amazing progress. So you see that with Proxima Cen B, this one, the one that causes this wobble of the star, it is 1.3 Earth mass, orbiting with a period of 11 days, and it is in the habitable zone of the star. One of the goals of many people is to find Earth-like planets, so similar masses, in the habitable zone of Sun-like stars, so more massive stars. And actually, this is much more difficult because the Sun, we know, is covered by as a granulation at its surface due to convection motion, as also spots, faculae on its surface, and as also, I'm sorry, you probably cannot see it, as also filaments and flares that create an activity that produce a very strong noise that we analyzed since 10 years with my colleague Nadège Meunier in Grenoble. And we show that because of this noise, it would be extremely difficult to detect Earth-like planets around Sun-like stars in the habitable zone of Sun-like stars with this method. Fortunately, there are many. There is at least another method which is called photometry. Sorry. In this method, it is still an indirect method. What we look at is to tiny variation dimming of the star brightness in the sky. If a planet happens to go in front of the star, between the star and us, we will have a small dimming of the star. Of course, this dimming is very small. Only 1% of the starlight, or in the case of the Sun and Jupiter, only 1% of the starlight is occulted, and the phenomenon happens every 12 years, and it lasts only a few hours. So the probability and the orientation has to be the right one. So the probability to see that is very small, but 1% can be detected. For the Earth, it's another one, it's 10 to the minus 4. It happens every year, and it lasts a few minutes. So as you can imagine, finding such planet means that either you know that there are planets detected by radial velocity, and you will look for transit, what we call transit. It's when the planet transits a star, or you look at many stars at the same time to have a good probability to find one. So the first transiting planet was found 20 years ago by David Charbonneau. It was found around a star for which a planet had been detected in radial velocity before. And since then, there have been a huge progress that has been made thanks to spacecraft that has been put in orbit. The first one was the CNES COROT satellite that was dedicated to look at very big field of the sky, in the sky, looking at thousands of stars at the same time. Then there was Kepler, which was a bigger, launched by NASA in 2009, and recently NASA has launched TESS that you maybe have heard about, and ESA has launched CHEOPS end of last year. And with Kepler has been able to find a lot of new planets, I will show, and from the first planet detected by transit to now, we have again won a factor of about 100. And again, we were able to detect Jupiter-like planet with the first instrument, and now we detect Earth-like planet with this instrument, with Kepler and the following instruments. And this means, again, the progress that have been done so far. In one case, in several cases, in a few cases, people have claimed to have detected even moons around some planets, but I must say that they are still debated. And this is the transit instrument, a photometric method with Kepler in particular, has allowed to detect thousands of new solar system, planetary system. And what is really incredible is the diversity in architectures of this system. In some systems, you have a large planet close to the star. In other systems, you have planets, the big planets are further away. In some cases, they are closer. And we find a diversity that nobody has had thought about before. Even more interesting is if you are able to couple radial velocity method and transit techniques, because radial velocity method with the Kepler laws give you the mass of the planet multiplied by the sinus of the inclination of the planet, while the transit method gives you the radius of the planet. So if you are able to observe both the radial velocity and the transit, as it was done for this target, you get the density of the planet. And then with the density of the planet, you can start thinking about the interior of the planet. And you can also, of course, start to think whether the planet is a gaseous planet or is rather a solid planet, and what would be likely its interior. And then you can really start to do to study the physics of the interior of the planet. And again, the results that have been obtained so far show a very big diversity in terms of density. And so for a given planet mass, you have all sorts of density possible, and models have been developed to try and explain this variety. But we are really at the start of this work. Now I come to the imaging part of the planets. I told you extrasolar planets. I told you that it is something that is really difficult. And to illustrate that, you can think that you take the solar system and you observe it from 10 parsecs away, so close to the sun, but at a given distance. Here I have the sun, the Earth of Jupiter, and Jupiter here would be seen at a distance, at an angular distance from the sun of 0.5 arc seconds, which is a basketball seen at 100 kilometers. Of course, for the Earth, it's even more difficult. And so we have one first problem is that the planet seen from the neighborhood, even from the neighborhood, the planets are very close angularly to their stars. And also, of course, there is a large contrast in the brightness of the planets with respect to the sun. Jupiter is about 100 million times fainter than the sun, and the Earth is a few billion times fainter than the sun. So it's really complicated to do that. And on top of that, we are observing, we need large telescope, obviously, to get a good spatial resolution to be able to distinguish angularly the planets from the star. So it means that you have to use big telescopes, and the big telescopes, the biggest telescopes are on the Earth. And the problem is that the light that before the light of the planet and the planet of the and the stars reaches the telescope, it has to go through the atmosphere, and the atmosphere deviates the light of the incoming light. The incoming wavefront is not a plane anymore, but is distorted, and that produces the fact that instead of seeing what we call a nice, let's say, a nice airy function for the star, we end up with what we call an airy pattern, which is a very ugly, let's say, and spread image of the planet, of the star. So in order to be able to see a planet, to get the photons of the planet and separate them from the photon of the star, we have to use what we call high contrast imaging assisted by adaptive optics. So what we do is that first we try to correct from the perturbation of the atmosphere. Here you have a sketch where you have the incoming wavefront, which is distorted due to the atmosphere of the Earth. Then we have a deformable mirror, a dichroic here, and which take a little part of the light, incoming light, to a wavefront sensor. And using this wavefront sensor, we compute the deformation that should be made of this on this deformable mirror, which is optically conjugated to the pupil of the telescope, the first mirror of the telescope, and then so that we can have a flat wavefront. And these techniques have been developed first in France for astronomy, and you have here an example of the wavefront that arrives perturbed and is then corrected, and the effect here, when you close when we close the loop of the adaptive optics system, which makes this correction, you end up with an image which is very much much thinner, and of course we can hope to resolve better the planets from the stars. Then we have to use a second stage, which is to block the starlight, because the star is so bright that we have to block it in order to be able to see the light of the planet. And the third level is post-processing techniques that take in order to suppress the halo that still remains after the blocking of the starlight. And so to give you an illustration of the performances that we can get now, this is the performances that we have with the best instrument in the world so far, which is called the Sphere. It is an instrument that was built for ESO by a consortium of a laboratory, and the principal investigator was Jean-Luc Beuzy in Grenoble. Sphere was installed in 2014 on the Very Large Telescope in Chile. And here I will give you an illustration of what of the performances of the system. Here we are observing in the near infrared H band, so about 1.6 micron with a sphere. We have here what we call a seeing limited image, so the resulting image of a star after having crossed the atmosphere. When we put the adaptive optics system on, this is the same image at the same scale, and you see very well the star and its airy ring. Of course, it is the same scale, so you see that we have much more chance to detect faint companion close to the star than before. With that, we gain a contrast of about 1000 at 0.5 arc seconds, which is still not enough. Then we block the light using a coronography, and we gain a factor of about 10 in the vicinity of the star in terms of contrast. And then we need the last step, which is, as I said, data processing. With this last step, we gain about a factor of 100. And then we are able to detect planets that would be 10 to the minus 6, 1 million times fainter than the star when being located at 0.5 arc second. So it is a huge gain, and adaptive optics has really, really revolutionized the field. So I will show you as an example the evolution over the years. The first adaptive optics system for astronomy was developed in 1990. It was installed at the 3.6 meter telescope in Chile. And you see here, in that case, it is all the three images are the same companion observed with the three different generations of system. And you see on the left a small signal here that is a brown dwarf. A brown dwarf is a body with a mass intermediate between the mass of the biggest giant planet, which is 13 Jupiter masses, and the first stars, the lighter stars, which are 80 Jupiter masses. A brown dwarf has a mass in between. And here you see with the first adaptive optics system and the first coronagraph, we could see barely the companion. Using NACO, an instrument that we built again in France for ESO at the Very Large Telescope. It was the first adaptive optics system at ESO on the VLT. The VLT is a telescope of 8.5 meters. In the desert of Atacama, you have, in fact, we have 4 VLTs here. And with this system, we could see much better the brown dwarf companion than in this case. And again, NACO was built by a consortium of 3 French institutes, including Observatoire de Paris, ONERA, and Laboratoire d'Astrophysique de Grenoble. And the last sphere that I talked about a while ago, it's a much improved system with much more actuator, much more degrees of freedom to correct for the perturbation of the atmosphere. You see here the companion that is totally resolved from the parent star. And SPHERE is the first example of what we called extreme adaptive optics for astronomy. Going back to the first images that we got in terms of exoplanets, extrasolar planets, actually we got the first images of planetary mass bodies orbiting here a star and here a brown dwarf. And these are images that we made with NACO, the instrument that I showed you. And the study were led by Gaël Chauvin from our team. And it was really the first time we could see the photons of planetary mass bodies orbiting something other than the sun. So this was in 2004. So this was the first detection. The planet here was located 260 astronomical units, so very far away from the star, much further away than what we have in the sun. But with improving instruments, we could, with the next generation of instruments, what I called extreme adaptive optics system, closer planets could be seen. And this is a very nice example of a family of 4 planets that were detected by my colleague Christian Marois, who was working on another instrument, which is called GPI in America, which is like SPHERE, but with slightly different capabilities. And he could observe this system. The closest planet here is at about 15 astronomical units from the star. And with the SPHERE, with NACO, we detected a planet here on a star that we know very well in Grenoble. And the planet here is located at 9 astronomical units. So it is at the same distance as Jupiter, as Saturn from the sun. This system is called Beta Pictoris, and we have been working a lot around on this system. Actually, I started my PhD working on this system because a disk of dust had been imaged around the star, and it was recognized as a possible remnant of a planetary formation, either a remnant or the cocoon where planetary formation was ongoing, because at this time we didn't know well the age of the star. And so we followed, we discovered Beta-Pic on data that we had obtained in 2003. We recovered the planet, we tried to observe again the planet, but we didn't see it. We had to wait until 2009 to detect the planet again. In fact, it had been gone behind the star and we couldn't see it. And now we have obtained a lot of data on this system. And as the period of Beta-Pic B is about, this is the discovery. And now these are all the observations that we have made of the planet. We are, as the period is about 20 years, we have covered most of the orbit of the planet. And it is so far still now the closest planet that has been observed, that has been imaged around the star. So this system is really fascinating. So we have this planet at 9 astronomical units. And last year, we discovered also an additional planet located this time at 3 astronomical units. And the detection was done in using radial velocity method. And it was really, really complicated because the star is a high pulsator. So it is a fascinating system. It has a disk, it has 2 planets, it has also comets that we detected back during my PhD thesis with Alfred Vidal-Madjar 30 years ago. It is the most complicated system, I would say, but that we know of, but it is also the richest one. And very recently, we could detect Beta Pictoris in a study led by Sylvestre Lacour in Observatoire de Paris in interferometry, using a long baseline interferometry combining the light of the 4 telescopes. We could detect both Beta-Pic B and Beta-Pic C in interferometry, which gives us a very precise position that we have analyzed we can get very precise information of the orbital properties of both planets, and we also got information on the atmospheric properties of the planets. And here in the case of Beta-Pic B, we have the famous CO line in the atmosphere of the planet. And these are 2 papers that are going to get out soon. If I come back to the images of the planet, here I've put all the planets that have been imaged so far. And you see that at distances close to those of the solar system, they are really not, not numerous at all. In fact, we have just been able to observe the brightest planet in direct imaging, and we did improve both the instruments and the data processing to observe lighter planets. This is a very nice example of a planetary system that we observed with our SPHERE instrument. Here you have a planet which is about 5 Jupiter masses, which is located in the cavity of what we call the transition disk. It is a disk of dust and gas that is that is still optically thick. And here the planet has swept up the material to form close to the star. It is at about 25 astronomical units from its star. And recently also, the planet has been seen in H-alpha, which means that it is still accreting material, and another planet in the system has also been detected. So this type of planet is really interesting to observe because we have, like Beta-Pic, we have both planets and disks. So it gives the opportunity to really understand the way planets form within disks. And with SPHERE, we could detect disks such disk with exquisite precision, and we have in many cases we have rings of material, we have spirals, which could be due to planets. It's not completely sure because there are other effects that could produce them, but in some cases it can be due to planets. So it could be indirect signs of exoplanets. And we have many studies to do on this system. Now I come and I will be almost finished to by a few conclusions on these observations. We have observed now today it's more like 4,300 planets. Different planets from the classes of planets have been detected. Massive planets such as the one that we saw in direct imaging, very far away from the star. Hot Jupiters, like 51 Pegasus, very close to the star, and other planets like Super Earth, which is a class of planet that doesn't exist in the solar system, which is planets with masses 1 to 5 Earth masses, close to the star, and there is no such planet in the solar system. We have detected ocean planets, so a lot of classes of planet, new classes of planet, which shows that there is a very important variety of planets. Some have, as I said, unexpected orbit, hot Jupiters or very remote planets. Some are on inclined orbits, whereas and eccentric orbits, whereas the planets of the solar system are rather on are not inclined and are on more or less non-eccentric orbits. So a lot of differences with the solar system, which shows us that probably, and altogether it shows us that probably the mechanism, the co-accretion mechanism I mentioned to form the planet, the giant planet of the solar system, globally, it is probably explaining most of the close planets that we have seen, but the planets that we see much further away may be due to gravitational instability within a disk rather than to co-accretion. Also, also, the fact that we see a planet very close to the star is probably due to hot Jupiters to planet disk interaction during the first mega years of the system, which leads to a migration of the planet towards the star. And there is also planet-planet interaction that can eject planets or in some cases throw planets in front of the star. Of course, there has been studies of atmosphere of extrasolar planets, both on hot Jupiters and on the remote giants that we see, and it's really complicated. The conclusion so far is that the atmosphere is very complicated, very difficult to see, especially because there are many hazes and clouds that prevent from seeing the molecular or atomic lines that we would like to see in some cases. So there are many remaining questions. We want to understand better some details of the planet formation processes. We still don't know how diverse are the planetary systems. We have seen a lot of diversity, as I showed you, but we have not explored all of it. We still don't know if the solar system is a very peculiar case or not. We still don't know if we could find Earth-like twins. So in the habitable zone, at least we know that it will not be easy. And we still have to find signatures of life on extrasolar planets. So there is a lot of work to be done. And the future is full of promise with new instruments. I mentioned TESS, Gaia, that are going to give results soon. GWST, the successor of the Space Telescope, which will be launched next year. Cheops that I talked about. And in the long-term future, we have a very big a project which is called the Extremely Large Telescope in Europe. It's a 39-meter telescope in the desert of Atacama, which has its first light most probably now in 2026 or 7. You have here the basement as it appeared 2 years ago. And also two major space projects, which is the ESA Plateau, to detect many transit of giant planets, super Earth and Earth around stars. It will fly in 2025. And the project Ariel, which is also a space project to do spectroscopy of the atmosphere of a giant planet and super Earth. And this goes to 2025 as well. And we are already thinking of the future after these instruments, and it will be probably from space. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just... Yes, thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for the very fascinating presentation. And I'm calling now for people to ask questions. So, well, we have a first question from Mohamed Mezwa. And this question is, in fact, yeah, comes to mind, obviously. In a solar type system, there is normally not one, but several planets. How do you distinguish the contribution from the different planets to the measured indirect velocity deviation?
Yeah, it's it's not easy. Most of the time, what you do is you remove the signal, you identify the identification in force radial velocity is very often based on a periodogram. We identify the highest peak, we remove the first planet, and then we go on. So it's incrementally. But in some cases, it's to do that a lot of data points. And at the beginning, people were finding many eccentric orbits, many eccentric planets. And in fact, when accumulating data, they saw that in fact it was not one planet, but there were two planets on more circular orbits instead of one planet on eccentric orbit. So I mean, it's not an easy task to identify multiple systems. You need to have a lot of data.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have a slight problem that I don't see the questions anymore, but I try to get them. So in the meantime, I'll ask a question of myself. You discussed the observations of atmosphere, composition of atmospheres, but do we have any information on the densities or pressures of the atmospheres?
It is model dependent. In fact, people use models of atmosphere, and they try to see how it fits with the lines that they see or not.
Thank you. I'm speaking to Anne-Françoise. Anne-Françoise, I don't see the questions anymore. Could you find something?
Yes, of course, Patrick. There is a question from Diego Pontoni, and he's asking, could B Pictoris be studied also by photometric measurements of the dimming of the star's brightness when the planet will pass in front of the star, or the orbit is inclined in the wrong way and we see the planet only hiding behind the star?
Well, in fact, this is a question that has taken a lot of time for us because with the data that we had, as you have seen, the orbit of the planet is seen almost edge-on. And, but modeling the orbit, we had, of course, a few degrees of freedom of uncertainty, let's say, on the inclination of the planet. And in fact, we saw that it would probably not transit the star. And, but nonetheless, we organized a a campaign, a photometric campaign to look for a transit of beta peak B in 2017. And we have been looking for a transit, we didn't see it. And now we have many, especially thanks to the interferometric data, we have a much more precision, we have a good precision on the orbit of the planet. And in fact, it is slightly above the Edge-on view. And so the planet will not orbit. Nonetheless, the Hill sphere of the planet, the sphere of influence of the planet could have orbited. We are still looking at the data to see if we have any sign of transit of the Hill sphere. But the planet, neither beta peak B or C will transit.
Okay.
Thank you. I have found a way of doing the questions. So we have a question from Angelica Rosa, which is, would you comment on the different forms of disks you can detect in coexistence with planets in exosolar systems? Would you be able to detect planetesimal planets of the size of Mars accreting with using an indirect method?
So yeah, in terms of disks, there are basically three types of disks that we may think of, and more or less they depend on the evolution of the star, of the system. Very, very young systems have very compact disks, what we call accretion disk, and they are optically thick, and it's very difficult to see inside, and it's very difficult, it's not possible to find planets even if they exist inside because they are optically thick. Then you have this type of system that I show here, the system that I showed, which are called transition disk, in which the material has already there is already a cavity in the disk, and you may see through the disk, let's say, and this disk happen, and this is something that has been seen only with the sphere and the radio interferometer ALMA. You see these structures that can be due to planets, and there have been a lot of modeling adding planets in such disk to see, to look at and to produce such type of structures. But stars, in some cases, binary stars can also produce this type of features. There can be also ways to produce such type of features or ring-like due to the different snow lines of the elements, so it's not a unique explanation. And you have also the disk like the beta peak debris disk, which is more evolved and which has which has a very little amount of gas around, while these stars here have still a lot of gas around. And in the case of beta peak, which is which is more dynamically evolved, actually, when we started to observe beta peak with the first adaptive optic instrument, ADONIS, we detected the disk, and HST also detected the disk. The disk was tilted in its inner part, and together with my PhD student, David Mouillet, we modeled the disk as due to the presence of a planet. And this was, at this time, it was too early to find the planet. We found the planet more than 10 years after. But it was also a sign of planet. So each type of disk can give indirect signatures of planets. A colleague, colleagues in Grenoble have also found a indirect way to find planets on gaseous disk observed in radio millimeter wavelengths. But all these are indirect detection. And of course, when you have indirect detection, you may have other explanations. They are not necessarily unique. And so it's much better to see the planets themselves. Well, better. What we want to do is to observe the planets themselves.
Thank you. We have a question from Jean-Sébastien Micha, which is, what could be the ultimate angular resolution measured with space telescope with or without interferometry, and what could be the biggest telescope in space?
Well, the next generation is obviously JWST, which is a 6.5 meter. So it is smaller than the than the 10-meter class telescope that we have today, and the small and much smaller than the ELT. There are studies now for a 10-meter or even bigger telescope in space, which would be totally dedicated to exoplanet science, with a very strong constraints in terms of quality of optics and so on. And it would be about 10 meters. I think that if you want to go bigger, you have to go to do space interferometry. And there have been propositions since a long time. There was this Darwin proposition made to ESA, which was called Darwin, which was a Nulling interferometer in space. It was small dishes, but separated, and the baseline gives a spatial resolution. It was not accepted by ESA. It was like 20 years ago. Antoine Labeyrie has also proposed since many, many years to have hundreds of small telescopes around, over 1,000 kilometers or so. But this is the difficulty here is to have the right way to measure the distances between the telescopes. And it's technologically very challenging, but it will probably be done. These space interferometers, it will probably be done in a few decades, I would say.
Thank you. Maybe I would like to add one question to this because it's related. What are, in your view, the prospects of improving very significantly the possibilities of chemical analysis for atmospheres of the planets, of the exoplanets? Do we have a lot of room for improvement, or?
Yes, we have a lot of room for improvement. And first we have to, well, I think that again, space, well, the ELT will bring some very important constraints on some planets, and Ariel will be fully dedicated to the study of atmosphere. Most of the time, the wavelengths will be near infrared and thermal infrared, and there are plenty of lines to discover. And there are a lot of tricks that have been found, not a lot, but a few tricks that have been found to improve the quality of the spectra that we can get. I will not enter in the description, but there have been tricks that have been found. We are also working on the combination of high contrast imaging and spectroscopy, and these are tools that are absolutely needed if we want to sometimes to look for signatures of life, because it will be only mostly by at least by the atmosphere, the information that we get on the atmosphere.
Thank you. Well, these are things that resonate very much with some of the challenges we have on the synchrotron as well. You told us that you have other commitments today, and so we don't want to take too much of your time, but we are so I'm sorry, we shall have to close the discussion now, but I want to thank you very much again for taking time to give us this wonderful presentation. And to all participants, I say thank you, and you're very welcome to join us again for a future colloquium or for the webinars And for this, you just have to have a look at the announcement on the SRF website. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, and goodbye.